I've got a few questions, and one person has written one down for me. And then, so I'll get things going with our guests, and then we'll have some time, more time for you all to ask questions as well. So be thinking of those if you want to jot them down. If you absolutely don't like speaking in microphones, you can jot it down and pass it to one of the guys with a microphone, and they'll bring it to me and I'll read it if that's your preference as well. So, but as we begin, I wanted to give Ian a chance to respond to some of the things Hans said regarding methodological naturalism, because that's your job, right?
First of all, I wanted to start off by saying I agree with almost everything you said, okay? Excellent. But in both of your lectures, particularly the second one. But there were a couple of aspects of the first one that I wanted to take a couple of issues with. Mm-hmm. First of all, I mean, I agree with you actually about the term methodological naturalism. I don't think it's a terribly helpful term. Mm-hmm. And I think that the idea that has become promulgated actually by quite a lot of Christian speakers, that science is involved in methodological naturalism is really a bit of a misrepresentation. I certainly am no type of naturalist, methodological or any other, okay? And I certainly believe God acts in the world in unique ways, and I don't rule that out in my view of the world. But I do think that science as we understand it today, and I mean science since the scientific revolution, the 17th century, took a specific term, and if you read my book, if you look up in the index of my book, you'll find that what I say is that I think it's the useful way to talk about science is that it's explaining nature naturally. And what I mean by that is that prior to the change of gears almost, intellectual gears of the scientific revolution, there was a great deal of dependence in our understanding of the natural world on authorities, on written authorities, scholarly authorities, Aristotle and folks like that. And one of the things that happened during the 17th century is that people stopped relying on those, and they started relying on experiment and observation directly in the way that I tried to describe in my first lecture. And so I think that actually there is something very important about the distancing of science as we now understand it from special revelation, for example, from a reliance upon authorities. And I think you would find a very strong resistance from scientists, whether they're Christian or secular for that matter, to any kind of pushback which suggests that we should rely on other types of revelation in the way that we pursue our science. So that's one comment that I wanted to make, and I wonder whether you had any.
Yeah, no, that's helpful, and I guess the question I have related to that is if science is about exploring, investigating, examining the creaturely domain, and if special revelation, God's word to us, which is primarily about our relationship, how to be reconciled to God, but if in giving us the message of how to be reconciled to Him, there are parts of that revelation that speak to the same space-time creaturely domain that we live in, and God's word speaks to that, then there's a potential, because you reject Noma, so we're not saying that special revelation and creation are completely unrelated, like non-overlapping magisteria. There is overlap. So what do you do when there are aspects of God's special revelation that do touch on the same area that science is investigating, and that touch on it in significant ways? So for instance, one example would be human beings. For instance, did God create Adam and Eve? long ago, or did Adam and Eve, did they evolve in some larger population? For instance, most traditional Christians would have said, oh, no, the Bible has something to say about that. Now, if I'm a scientist and I'm examining that question, if I say I can't, Genesis is not part of my database, my evidence base, neither is Romans 5, neither is 1 Corinthians 15, 21 to 22, and if those passages are speaking to that question, that seems difficult for me I'm wrestling with that question.
Okay, so I think I understand the issue, but what I want to draw your attention to is that I worked quite hard in my first lecture to explain why I think it's justified to speak about science as if it's not just about the creaturely domain. Mm-hmm. In other words, when you use the expression the creaturely domain, I regard that as talking about an immensely wider scope than I consider the natural philosophy of the science that I'm talking about to be addressing itself to. So I agree with you, that special revelation has something to do with the creaturely domain.
Right.
But I would argue that what science is doing is very specifically relying upon reproducibility and the kind of clarity that I tried to explain. And that if that's so, then its application is inherently limited. Now, I recognize that there is a scientistic tendency in our society as a whole to regard what I've called that natural scientific domain as the totality of the creaturely domain. But I would argue that you're in danger, in my mind, of confusing science with scientism, okay? And so I certainly reject scientism, and I certainly think that our Christian understanding of God and of the world and so forth, and creation, are important in the creaturely domain as a whole. But I think I am willing to give science the liberty to say, let us focus upon those things which are the reproducible aspects of the world. If you like, it's the normal course of nature, and find out what it tells us. And don't insist that we must always have this broader view. I haven't really seen any evidence in my own understanding of there being, as you say, anything specific in the way of a database that comes from outside of that. I don't mean to say, though, finally, just to clarify even more, I don't mean to say that theology is irrelevant to science. I mean, I've actually argued that theology is very relevant to science and has historically been so, and I think you and I are completely in agreement on that.
Right. So a follow-up question, and you're right. I mean, I appreciate how you emphasize clarity and reproducibility. So my question is, how many do all scientists agree with that definition? For instance, I'm wondering if a biologist would agree with that. And the reason I'm wondering about that is that with biology, as opposed to physics, there's a historical dimension to it's a historical science. And the kinds of things that an evolutionary biologist, for instance, is dealing with, I'm not sure what reproducibility would mean in their discipline. And that then raises a bigger question, which philosophers of science have called the demarcation problem. And the demarcation problem, like in a nutshell, is the conclusion that philosophers of science have arrived at, which is that no one can define what counts as science and then what doesn't count as science. That all attempts to try to find that answer have failed. But based on your lecture, it would seem to me that you would have a more optimistic view on that question. But I think philosophers of science would disagree and would say that actually anyone who tries to define what's in and what's out, that whole project has failed.
Well, that's a very good point. Thank you for that, because the so-called demarcation problem is a celebrated issue in the philosophy of science, and you're quite right to say that in large measure philosophers of science in the late 20th century sort of gave up on that project. I am not actually claiming to have solved the demarcation problem, okay? I will claim, though, to have identified two extremely important and maybe definitive characteristics of science, which I've explained. The other thing that I want to say is that the reason why the demarcation problem and the attempt to solve the demarcation problem failed was largely because of scientism. Because basically what people were trying to do in the 20th century was to define those things that are real knowledge and those things that aren't real knowledge, okay? And so in the context of a scientific outlook, it is of course impossible to solve that problem, because all disciplines that aren't really natural sciences are going to object strongly and rightly to being relegated by that mechanism. And so in answer to the first question, would scientists all agree with my characterization of science? They wouldn't, because most scientists don't even think about these questions. They just get on and do the science, okay? So most scientists are not philosophers or historians of science.
Interesting. So this question, I think, is aimed at understanding how, Ian, you as someone who does your work on the principles of methodological naturalism.
No.
I don't
accept that characterization.
So that's what. So what would you call what you do in a lab, if it's not
explaining nature naturally?
Okay. So that's the
that's the
distinction.
phrase I'm willing to
So that's what we're willing to
stand
say.
by. Okay?
Well, let me read the question, and I think you'll hear what it's getting at. As Christians, we know that all wisdom comes from God, and even that He grants more wisdom if we ask. So why would a Christian scientist not want that maximum amount of wisdom when approaching science? When presented with a problem in a lab, would that person be discouraged to pray for wisdom, or like how do you? Yeah. What is devotional life like for you?
That's a great question.
Laboratory?
I do sometimes pray for my science. Yeah. Okay, not in the sense very rarely in the sense of God, show me the answer to this problem, but more in a commitment sort of way, presenting the science to God. By the way, we have this image of scientists as being people who work in the lab or in some kind of isolated environment. The science that I do is not at all isolated. Almost everything that is done in my field is done as a matter of teamwork. I was the head of a big project at MIT with 100 people who worked on it. There were 20 graduate students. There were 16 scientists. There were 20 engineers and 26 technicians. I was the head of a big project. Boy, did I pray for those people, okay, for that team. So yes, I absolutely do think that prayer is part of science, and I mentioned in my talk that I think being a Christian made me a better scientist, and it's in some of those relational areas that's true.
So we want to say that, and I think, if you read Ian's book, this comes through, that your Christian faith is a deep part of the work you do professionally.
Yeah, and that's why I resist this phrase methodological naturalism,
right.
Because most people do interpret it the way that Hans interpreted it, which is to say that science is trying to study and explain nature as if there were no God. I reject that completely. That is not how scientists over the centuries have done their work. They have actually largely, in historical times, done it as if there were a God. Okay, so it's not methodological naturalism in that interpretive phrase. Okay.
So the distinction would be explaining the physical world as if there's no God versus explaining the creation under the conviction of a creator, or how? I'm trying to help us really understand how you distinguish that.
It is certainly the case that we are trying to explain the workings of the world insofar as they can be explained by efficient causes, that is, by proximate causes, okay, as opposed to what Aristotle would have called final causes or first causes. So it is, and I said that very clearly. I mean, I pointed out that with that little vignette about Monod, that I thought he was right when he said that science rules out purpose in its types of descriptions. So it's true in that sense that science is trying to explain the world, and that's what I mean by naturally in this phrase, explaining nature naturally. But that doesn't mean to say that there is any kind of commitment, or was any kind of commitment on the part of scientists to the idea that that's all that's worth talking about, or that that's all that nature is. It's just we're going to explain nature in those terms as far as we can go.
Is it fair to, if you're going to talk about the history of science, that kind of a methodological naturalism is something of a novelty then? I mean, is it that
absolutely?
New? Yeah.
It was
shouldn't
part.
be.
It was part of it was one of the moves that was made in the sort of late 16th and the 17th centuries,
Right.
to stop, saying, well, we've got to figure out how Aristotle was right and apply these concepts. And it was an abandonment of Aristotle's approaches, many of which talked about essences and there were various 4 different types of causes, and there were 4 elements and all these. We set aside those and we said, no, we're not going to accept that basis just on the basis of what Aristotle said. We're instead going to insist on practical science. That's what Francis Bacon emphasized most importantly. And if you're going to do practical science, then you have to pay attention to how the world actually works, and you've got to do experiments, and you've got to have reproducible responses of nature, because that's the way you're going to have something that's practically useful.
But just what you've just said now, I get it that methodological naturalism can be misunderstood or can evoke certain things, but it seems like you did say you're not an Aristotelian, and that you reject that way of understanding nature.
I reject that way of investigating
nature,
or relying on the data from.
So I guess I'm confused. Apart from perhaps lay people might hear methodological naturalism and think, oh, metaphysical naturalism, or he doesn't pray in the lab, or those misperceptions. I'm still not clear why you're rejecting what the substance of what, because you know that it was De Vries, I'm forgetting Paul De Vries who coined that phrase in Christian Scholars Review, I believe, some years back, and a number of evangelical scientists have said in print, this is what we do. And you're right that many scientists don't reflect philosophically on their activity, but to my mind, based on the literature, it's kind of a commonplace that methodological naturalism is what scientists do. So I'm wondering, are you pushing back in a substantive way, or are you just sort of like, I don't want to be boxed in by that phrase?
Okay, so I think there are a number of people historically who've agreed with the philosophical point that as a Christian, it's possible to study the world insofar as it can be described by efficient causes. And if you want to call that methodological naturalism, that is what we do. Okay? Mm-hmm. But the problem is that has acquired the kind of baggage that you explained rather carefully this morning, okay? And I don't agree with the notion that I'm doing my science as if there were no God. Okay. That's simply a false representation of what I do.
Right, understood.
That's helpful. Let's maybe, I want to switch gears just a bit and talk about kind of the new atheism, the aggressiveness that, I think we're reacting against. But I want to start by saying, what are the best arguments that you've run into from the new atheists and that kind of, what is it all, because we've discounted and kind of tried to rebuff quite a few of those, but what are the more substantive ones that we really need to be paying attention to, and not so much the ones where we go, well, that's a category mistake, or where are the key places to put energy?
In denying the claims of the new atheists,
So,
or are you
yeah,
asking me
so
what are the best, most believable claims of the new atheists?
Yeah, I think that's what it is. So amongst the new atheists, what are the most substantive and believable claims that they make?
Well, I think that in some respects, the new atheists are right to say that historically and even today, there is a tension and in some cases a rejection of science by Christians, by the church. And so I'm going to talk about this in a few minutes, but it is in fact historically true that the Christian church has on occasions resisted new discoveries of science, and that has given the church, in many people's minds, and sometimes even my mind, a bad rep, okay? Sure. So I think that those are believable claims at some level. What the trouble with it, just to put the flip side to that, is that extending that to the idea that there's always been a warfare between science and religion generally is taking that observation to excessive extreme.
And why do people find, Hans, maybe you can jump in here, the arguments of the new atheists so exciting and compelling? Because there's a serious following there. Mm-hmm. What's the thing? Because I read it and I go, this is some of the most ridiculous things I've ever easily refutable. Right. Why is it so persuasive?
But it might be that because of your intellectual pedigree and you're learned and you're a pastor and you read, but widely. But I think for a lot of people, there is sort of the rhetorical bluster. I'm thinking of Hutchinson particularly, but there's verbosity and flexing and rhetoric and so on that just impresses people. So I think there's some, which is fairly superficial, but I think there's some of that. And it's just sort of feisty. And I mean, they're in this. They've come out here to fight it out. So I think that kind of rhetoric lends itself to kind of gathering a following, particularly from those who are not favorably disposed to Christianity in the first place. And so it taps into perhaps kind of the culture wars that are kind of a broader problem in North American society, especially. And then I guess maybe going back to your initial question, or to piggyback on what Ian said, I think maybe one way one thing we can learn from them is that I think a lot of evangelicals and Christians just maybe we don't know what we're talking about when it comes to science, and we seriously need to bone up on material. At least just don't talk about something you don't know anything about, right? Because at least the new atheists, they know their science, and so, but to the extent that there are a lot of Christians who don't really know what's going on in the scientific areas, in some ways they can have a field day sort of exposing the weaknesses in our communities. So I think that's also part of it.
And you hit on something that is a concern for me, is that it's largely a rhetorical thing. Yeah. Because, and this relates to another question, is so much of this seems to be methodological. I mean, how we define knowledge and come to discover knowledge, those are prolegomena questions, right? That's not, so the questions about making metaphysical claims from physical sciences, those are methodological issues. And so how often does the debate boil down to those kinds of, I mean, if we got our categories straight, would it be such a problem? Is that?
Yeah, I mean, I think that Hans has pointed to something rather important, is that with the exception of Christopher Hitchens, most of the new atheist writings come from people who are scientifically knowledgeable. And the way that knowledgeability kind of works is that they use it, and in the case of, for example, Dawkins, he's written brilliant books about evolution that have been, before he really got onto the anti-theistic viewpoint. He wrote popular books to try to explain science to people, and he became very good at it. And his books are still quite good at it, okay? But the problem is that he's trying to use that, as a kind of springboard into what end up being theological and philosophical claims. And when he does that, he does it in a way which is, to someone who's theologically or philosophically educated, naive in the extreme. And so then you're puzzled about, why would people read this book? I mean, it's completely naive, right?
Right. And that's something I run into in the field of New Testament studies. You have folks who play by the rules with their peers, but not among the population. All right, so you have a person like Bart Ehrman who makes claims in his books that you could never get away with at an academic conference on the Bible. But the average person who hasn't had a specialized training isn't or the freshmen in his Intro to New Testament class simply are not yet equipped to be able to realize what he's doing to them unfairly.
Right.
And so it sounds like there's a similar thing happening there.
I think one good lesson, I think it's tangentially related, but a good lesson is that those who are on the side of the angels in academia, there is a kind of socialization where you write for your fellow scholars or you write for the guild. But the one thing that the new atheists and whatever the complementary group is in your field, one thing I think, the one indirect kind of benefit is there's something to writing for popular audiences. And don't just write for your guild. And if they're going to put out this stuff, and if it's problematic, then people from our group need to write engaging, popular level books that are pithy, winsome, provocative, compelling, as a sort of ballast, to counter and so on, so that because otherwise you create this vacuum. We're just talking to ourselves, and meanwhile, and then the new atheists can just kind of come in and then write these really scintillating, superficial but scintillating books that a lot of people are drawn into.
I don't know if you have a...
No, that's okay.
Yeah, so I'll ask this question, and then if we have some questions here. In both of your presentations, I noticed, one of the thoughts that struck me was how difficulty we seem to be able to sort of maintain a balance or hold a tension. And the examples were, I think, Ian, in your talk, you have on the one side sort of the new atheist rejection of religion, and then you have kind of a postmodern rejection of science, and there's this back, and everyone's rejecting everyone. And then, and you mentioned, the Pentecostal chaos versus the cessationist. And I think we've all sort of articulated, I appreciate you guys because you've both articulated sort of mediating. Different groups have things to contribute. Why do we have such a hard time? Why do we run? Is it a cultural thing? Is it a human thing? But we just seem to run to the other side of the spectrum so quickly. Is that I don't know if that resonates with you or not, but.
Well, I think we've fallen. That's one answer. But I also think, and this comes back to this question of why are these books so popular, that there's something inherent in humans that they love a gladiatorial battle.
Yes.
And this makes better media impact if there's a big knockdown argument than if there is a friendly, collegial discussion of what our real differences are. And as you know, I do a lot of speaking with the Veritas Forum, where we try to have dialogues between atheists and Christians that are respectful and of the sort of more collegial type. And I think they're tremendously successful, and enormous numbers of students will actually come out in many of these universities to hear these types of discussions. But when it comes to making an impact on YouTube or public television, it's not those kinds of meetings that get, in the end, put out there. It's the gladiatorial debates.
Sure.
And the same is active in politics.
When I hear that, I think, what a shame.
What a shame. Exactly.
It really is. Questions? There's one in the back on flip side.
Dr. Hutchinson, that you, at the first, when we got started, you said you definitely were not a naturalist. Can you give a good lay definition of what is a naturalist?
What I meant by naturalist, by saying that, was I am not someone who believes that, in any sense, nature is all there is. I believe there is something beyond nature, if you like it, supernature or whatever. And I believe that science is studying nature. The natural sciences are studying nature, but there are many other studies which are of greater or at least equal importance.
Yeah, that's helpful. On this nature-supernature question, Hans, I thought of during your last talk on miracles. You have instances in the Bible where natural events are given supernatural meanings. So I'm thinking of the east wind that pushes back the Red Sea, right? From Pharaoh's perspective, the east wind pushed back the Red Sea. From Moses' perspective, God sent the east wind to push back the Red Sea and deliver his people. So you have that sort of dynamic. You have Jesus saying things like, on the one hand, he says, look how God clothes the lilies of the field, right? We look at the flowers and we think, well, that's pretty, but we don't, it's not necessarily a divine action, at least not explicitly. So you've got Jesus sort of attributing divine action to God feeding the birds when they get up looking for the worms, flowers in bloom, but then you've got loaves and fishes too. So I wonder, can you help us think through how God is at work in what appear to be natural ways for us, but acknowledging that the Bible, it doesn't limit that to, it doesn't portray natural, what we would call natural things, as devoid of divine action.
Right. So in some ways I did try to answer that in the talk, because what I was trying to say is there is this thing called God's ordinary providence, and that God is, so I would say the example of the lilies, that's an example of God providentially, the beauty of these flowers is God's providential action, but and in that sense, it's depending on how you work out a notion of providence, but that God sustains the world moment by moment, including, no sparrow falls to the ground outside of his hand. So that notion, and that was what I was saying. I think for a lot of lay Christians, if you miss that biblical reality, but you want to preserve a notion of miracles, then what happens is you then have this view that you don't realize that God is present and providentially active all the time, but then you want to preserve, but God does miracles. That's what I meant by semi-deistic. It's a view that, God is not here, and then suddenly he shows up and a miracle happens. I think that's a problem. I think the biblical view is that God is present now. God is here now. He sustains the lily. He sustains these natural processes, and then every now and then, in answer to prayer or for some other reason, God is active in a different way, and which the Bible might call a miracle, a signs and wonders. But then when we want to talk about the supernatural, I do think that there are many ways to be nuanced on that. So for instance, there is Jesus being raised from the dead, and that kind of supernatural is, that's about as dramatic. That's as dramatic as it gets. But then you can have extraordinary coincidences, and it's none are coming to mind right now, but there are examples in Scripture where it's just a certain number of things come into place, and it's attributed to God. It's not the same category as the resurrection of Christ, nor is it God's providential action, right? So I do think systematic textbooks will kind of you'll have people parsing it out. So I think there are ways we can have the big banner of supernatural, but then if you look in the biblical material, there are slightly different nuances. And so I would put ordinary providence on one hand, the resurrection of Christ, the Exodus event over here, and then it's too late in the day for me to be able to give you a good answer. But then there are things in between, yeah.
So I just wanted to thank you for your talk on miracles this morning, which was excellent, and I think you drew particularly this question about the presence of God, how the Son upholds the universe by His word of power. Very, very, very important. Just to pick up this thought on the biblical ideas of miracles, we're often offered, not so much by biblical scholars, but by people who haven't really carefully thought about it, the definition of a miracle as being a violation of natural law. This is a terrible, a bad, non-biblical definition of what a miracle is. And I wanted just to endorse, the fact that there's a whole spectrum of different types of signs, of mighty works, and so forth, in the Bible, and very often, there's no way to tell whether there was a violation of natural law. When Jesus stilled the storm, on the Sea of Galilee, was that a violation of natural law or not? There's no way to tell. I mean, it could have been just a coincidence, okay? Or it could have been, something that changed the laws of nature in such a way that the winds died down. I don't know. You will never know, or maybe we will know when we meet Him face to face. But it didn't change. It doesn't change whether or not it was a sign or a wonder or a mighty work.
Do we run fast and loose with the phrase "laws of nature"?
Absolutely.
Define it, and then maybe help us reel in our.
I'm in danger of taking my own thunder here, but the whole idea of laws of nature actually originated as in the minds of people of faith, by the way, who were theists and regarded those laws of nature in certain respects as parallels with the laws that would come down from a king or from human laws. And so that was the way things started. As Hans pointed out earlier today, though, we've reached the point nowadays when we tend to think about the laws of nature as having a kind of self-existence, of being some kind of abstract compulsion, some force of nature somehow that sustains itself. That's a rather different view.
Right. The reason I asked, I was with a group of folks last month, and one of the gentlemen made this statement, like laws of nature are not laws like governmental laws or something like that. It's things we've observed repeatedly that appear to be very, 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 very consistent, and the way that it's used popularly tends to misportray that.
Well, today that's the case.
Yeah.
But historically, people arrived at the ideas of laws of nature in part from a theological viewpoint.
And sorry, I was going to say, related to that, I do think, and this is related to some of what Ian said yesterday, there are scientists who are working in various scientific disciplines who reject Christianity, who reject the God of the Bible, and yet they accept that tomorrow when I go to do my work, certain things are gonna, I can accept a certain consistency in, whether it's in the lab or outside the lab or whatever. There's a kind of consistency that I rely on or that I assume in my work as a scientist. But in some ways, that's kind of what we might call borrowed capital, because for the Christian, it's the consistency of God, is that God is a reliable God, and that the fact that the sun rises and sets, at least colloquially, the sun rises and sets every day, how do we know that's going to happen tomorrow or the day after? We take it for granted, but it's the intelligence of God, the reliability, the faithfulness, and so on, which I think older scientists, who were often the earliest scientists who were Christians, they had a lot of theological assumptions with that have now, those have been evacuated, and yet now scientists are operating with these assumptions, but about the consistency of nature, which originally reflected deeper theological beliefs.
It's helpful. Others? A question. Let's be sure we move to our questions quickly so that everyone has time.
Number 5, in your previous talk, you were talking about the practical theology of miracles, and you said pressing into the realities of the Bible. As a scientist and a theologian, would you speculate on what Jesus had in mind when he was telling his followers they would do greater things than he, in terms of scope or scale, or what do you think he meant in doing greater things than he?
I'll say something and then defer to Matt.
There's lots of deferring happening this weekend, isn't there?
But no, I think the way I've read that, at least in the immediate context, I'm thinking of perhaps a more immediate reference is what his disciples were going to be doing after his resurrection. And I'm trying to remember. I mean, I'm inclined to think, one, not just the miracles that the disciples performed in the book of Acts, for instance, but also that people would be, as a result of their preaching, people were being regenerated, being given new life, and translated from the kingdom of darkness to light as a result of their preaching, and that was something the disciples were doing, and that's something that we all have the privilege of doing as we share the gospel. But there's probably whole lot more going on there. But
Yeah, I'm inclined to think that it's not limited to the miraculous.
Mm-hmm.
That Jesus during his ministry in Israel is geographically and spatially restricted to some. He is condescended. He's taken on the finitude of a human body. He still has that human body, but now enthroned in heaven, he is universally accessible and universally at work through his Spirit. And so, if you think about the work he did while he was here, or on earth, is to a certain scale, but upon his ascension and empowering of his church with his Spirit, we've come a long way in the last 2,000 years. There's quite a few more Christians today than there were in AD 45, and I think that's the Lord's work, and it is indeed a great thing. So, other questions, Stan?
It's for Dr. Hutchinson. You mentioned or just touched on last night fine-tuning. Do you have an example in your field of study that would be a fine-tuning?
Not really, no. Fine-tuning is the way I use the phrase, and most people use the phrase, is a way of referring to the general structure of the laws of nature as we understand them from physics, and the fact that there are, within those laws, a number of constants which, as far as we can tell, don't have to have the values that they have, the speed of light or whatever it might be, all these different kinds of things. We usually talk in terms of dimensionless ratios, actually. And that if those things had different values, then the world would be utterly different. We probably would not have the complexity that we have of our chemistry or of biology. We wouldn't have creatures who are sentient like ourselves, and the world would be totally different. And so that is the sense in which one talks about fine-tuning. So if by my field you mean physics, then that's my answer to your question. If you mean by my field plasma physics or something like that, not so much, because plasma physics really takes for granted that the laws of nature are the way they are, and tries to work out their consequences, whether it be in the way that stars, the structure of stars work, or the way that the solar wind blows past the Earth and the magnetic field of the Earth works, or the way we try to confine plasmas in order to make fusion work. So I think that's kind of the nearest thing I can give you to answer that.
Others? Right back in the back. Just keep your hand up, they'll find you.
So for all three of you, what is your opinion on whether we should be teaching more apologetics and science, not necessarily on worship service on Sunday morning, but in our churches, to prepare us to have an answer, and especially our young people to have an answer?
I'll let our guest go first, then I'll tell you what we're doing.
I am very hesitant to say yes to that question. And the reason is this. I'm sure that a lot of people perceive what I do when I come to fascinating meetings like this as apologetics. I mean, and it is, in a certain sense, apologetics, in the sense of it is trying to give a rationale for the truthfulness of our Christian faith. But I think that it's become a fashion within the Christian church to do some kind of emphasis on apologetics as a discipline. And I am nervous about that, because I think effective apologetics requires an extremely deep understanding of whatever discipline you're talking about in relationship to the Christian faith. And so I think the people, and maybe this is self-promotion if you like, the people who are best at talking about what's the relationship between Christianity and science are not people who've read apologetics books. They're actually scientists, and that's why I'm here. So there is a sense in which what I think it would be very helpful, for example, if we heard more often from scientists, let's say from the pulpit or in Sunday school or adult educational opportunities in our churches. I hope, the fact my presence at this meeting is helping you. Otherwise, I'm wasting my time. And so that's what I would most advocate, is that we as a Christian church open our hearts and our minds to ministry from fellow Christians who are working in a discipline like the sciences and have something to share to help us to understand that world better.
Hands.
Yeah, I appreciate what Ian has said. I mean, and I take that to be just important cautions, which I resonate with. But I do think apologetics, and part of it depends on what do you mean by that. And I think there's a sense of apologetics that gets into this, I'm in this particular camp, and here all these other views I reject, and this is my standard bearer, that kind of thing, which, I'm not sure that's always helpful. But I do think young people, high school students, college students, there's a lot pressing on them, certainly existentially and psychologically, but intellectually, and they have a lot of questions. They have questions. They want to know certain things, like, why is there, given this so-called truth that our culture gives us, how does that reconcile to what the Bible says or what we keep hearing on Sundays? In that sense, equipping them just to be able to thoughtfully engage that and to hear winsome, sort of thoughtful, compelling answers that root them further into the faith rather than sort of nudging them out of the doors of the church. If that's arguably apologetics, then yes, I do think I do think our young people need like good models of that, and we need to provide context for them to be exposed to thoughtful answers that are actually engaging pressing questions of our day, and because they're very much, they're just in the thick of it, and it's really hard. I mean, I don't want to exaggerate, but I mean, in some ways it's really hard to be a young person and be faithful, you know, for different reasons, but not least of which are sort of intellectual challenges. And so I think to the extent that we can help them along, and to the extent that apologetics is a part of that, I would say yes, yeah, we need that, with those cautions in mind.
Yeah, and I find all of that helpful on both accounts. Just in terms of ministry strategy, we have, with a fair bit of consistency, have been offering small groups that aren't marketed as apologetics, but are sort of offered as a science and faith course or small group or study. And we've found folks have an interest in that. And I think it is giving them a chance to do what you guys are calling for, is have they're not going to be specialists, but there is a growing awareness and acquaintance with the issues and what's going on, which puts you in a better position to be able to articulate why you believe what you believe, right? So it's not apologetics as a discipline in itself, but it is sort of functioning in that direction, particularly in light of just the combative nature of our world right now with these issues. And we're having some discussion about what it'll look like as we kind of restructure our youth ministry the next year or so, to build some of those kinds of experiences into the process of spiritual formation for middle school, high school students, so that they're thinking through some of the issues and they don't get to college and all of a sudden a antagonistic professor just goes after them and they don't have any background to be able to, we don't want our kids being the folks you described who have no science whatsoever and just get taken apart.
And sometimes it's I mean, that's the sort of stereotype. They go to college and
right.
then, but and then sometimes it's just they're sitting in the pews and they're struggling intellectually or emotionally or psychologically with something that is at bottom is a struggle between what they know their faith says and some experience they're having, and there are all kinds of answers they're getting out there, and through the smartphone and TV shows, etc., Netflix and so on. They're getting all these alternative answers. They're feeling these things, and then they're in the pews, and the shame would be if they, I went to church all my life in the church, and I never heard anything. I never heard anyone help me with this particular struggle.
And I've had college students say those sorts of things to me,
right.
which has motivated a lot of what we're doing, things like this conference. Mm-hmm. And so I think there's a multifaceted approach to that in terms of ministry, where whether it's a special event like this or a small group mm-hmm. or a long-term plan for youth formation, we're trying to build the things in that help people of all ages mm-hmm. Be able to navigate the world that we live in. So that's the goal. It is time for our next break. We're going to take a short break to reset the stage, and then Ian will have our closing lecture. So thanks for your questions, and we'll reconvene at 3 o'clock.